Carthage must be destroyed. We are going to continue on with our Clash of Spears walkthrough today. In the last video, we looked at the sequence of play, or at least we started the sequence of play in the fourth chapter of the book. We were looking at the strategy phase and the activation phase. We want to finish the activation phase today by looking at the various actions you can do. Last time we talked about how when you activate a unit, you have to do a test of the commander using command points and testing to see if they pass a fatigue test, if you will. So they have fatigue and they test it against their grit to see if they can actually pass the test. We use 2d6 for activations and 1d6 for reaction tests. And we talked about how they'd switch between the active player and the non-active player, or the reactive player when they're playing. So today we're going to actually look at the actions units can do. Not every unit can do every action. I mean, obviously, if somebody is armed with bows, they could shoot, but if they don't have a bow, they're not going to shoot, right? So not every unit can do every action, and when you get into the units and the unit types, it will get more into what they can and can't do. But we're just going to go through some of the most, the basic actions, or what the book is considering the actions here. So every time you do an action, you may have some fatigue built on top of your unit by doing that action. And the first action we want to look at is simple movement. Now, when you actually move guys on open terrain, you're not really going to get a lot of fatigue going, okay? Most troops moving on open terrain aren't going to have any fatigue buildup. However, that's not always the case. Some heavily armored troops may have more difficult times moving open field and stuff like that. They may have more of a difficult time moving through open terrain, depending on how many action tokens they've used. And I just want to put your attention here. We showed you this chart, I think it was in either the second or third video in this series, where you have a fatigue chart and you look at your saves, basically how heavy your kit is and how well a unit can save stuff based on their armor. And you can see that if you're a lighter troop, you're going to have less problems moving through terrain than you would if you're a heavier troop, right? And we'll get more into how this works soon, but this is where this fatigue chart for movement starts coming into play, okay? Now, just to go quickly through, there's loose order movement and closed order movement. So a loose formation, like so, gets to move a little farther than a closed formation. So when they do move, they're moving 4 inches per action, basically 4 inches per move. So what the rulebook is stating you do is you move him 4 inches in whatever direction he wants to go. And then you're supposed to take a template that's a 4-inch circle and make sure the rest of the guys move up in there with him. I personally think that a lot of times people who are playing war games already kind of have a good sense of what a 4-inch template would be like. So if you want to use a template for proper standing, that's okay. But I think most people probably just move without the template. You can tell that this would be in a 4-inch template. Maybe this guy'd be up a little farther. But I mean, within a circle there, I think it's a 4-inch template. So that's basically it for moving open formation guys, loose formation guys. They just move 4 inches in the direction they want to go. And they don't have to be perfectly in that diameter. They can be partially within. So, I mean, some of it's common sense. They're not going to be like, the guy's not going to be way off here. They're going to kind of keep that diameter of 4 inches. Now, I put these guys in what a closed formation might look like. If you guys are in closed formation, they're going to be moving a lot more slower, right? They're keeping a maintained order. They don't want to move as far. So closed formation guys only move 2 inches. Now, these guys, what you do is something similar. You'd move one lad in the 2-inch direction you want to go, and then you just have to make sure all these models follow up and they keep their formation when moving. They can only move 2 inches here. You want to keep the same kind of facing. Whereas remember, if they're open formation, they don't really have a facing there. They got the whole 360-degree surrounding area. But a formed unit like so, that's in a closed order form, they only have the one facing. The rulebook does state you can slowly kind of shift as long as nothing moves beyond 2 inches. Like, for example, say you move this guy in a way that he moves 2 inches this way. As long as none of these models behind him don't move in 2 inches, they can kind of slightly turn. But they're still keeping their front and they're not going too excessively beyond there. The rulebook gets a little more better with their diagrams explaining it. Now these guys are enemies here, and like most games, when you're moving, your friends, your allies cannot move through enemy units. The same thing is here. You can never move through an enemy unit. You also can't move within 1 inch of an enemy unit unless there's impassable terrain here that it says that that's blocking you. So typically you're not going to be moving up to the enemy or moving through them. And then after they've moved, whether it's close formations 2 inches or loose formations 4 inches, you're putting an action token beside it, and then you can compare to your charts to see, okay, they're going to continue moving. Do they accumulate any further fatigue for moving? If they're open terrain order, like, or if it's an open terrain like this and they're lightly decked out troops like this, they can probably move without much penalty. Of course, if they're in harsher terrain or heavier troops, that may not be the case. So you have to pay attention to that fatigue chart. I should state there too, if these guys are open formation, if they have a friendly unit that's also open formation, they could possibly move through them. But you can't end the turn on top of them. And no models can pass through friends that are closed, friends or enemies that are closed formation, because they're too close to get anything by. They'll cause a bit of chaos and some anger against these closed people if their open formation their open formation friends try to get through. So I put a kind of linear obstacle here to describe the next part of this movement section. Basically, if you have a linear object that is crossable and a loose formation unit approaches it and they get a movement in, if they approach it, no matter how far away within the 4 inches, or maybe it's only 1 inch, they move up and they use their whole move just to move up to it. They'll stop there. In order to cross this linear formation, if they want to, they'd have to use an entire move action to jump it. Okay? And a closed unit doing that, let's say they wanted to do the same thing, they will automatically form into loose formation to jump over that linear object. And of course you'd use again an action point to do that. You would have one lad cross it, touching the base, and then you of course this is if you pass the action and then you know, they put an action point on there, all that stuff, and then the rest of the unit would just follow around it. So, and of course you got to follow the 4 inch diameter. This might be a little, this I don't think would be a legal move because these enemies are within 1 inch away, so you wouldn't be able to do this because it's within 1 inch of the enemy. But say these guys aren't here, then you'd want to put them in that 4 inch diameter around him, and that would take an entire action move. So moving up to the linear obstacle stops them, be it they open or close formations, and then they need an entire action, entire move to just get over it. And that's, you know, there's some different rules for cavalry, but we'll go through that later, but that's like basically the movement. So movement is basically going to be pretty simple if they're light troops and it's open terrain, but you'll have to pay attention to the fatigue chart and the different fatigues that may happen, or the different movements that may happen, and it may build fatigue as you move your troops along. The next action, of course, is attacking, and to perform an attack, it's going to put 1 fatigue on your unit, okay? Regardless of what it is, you're going to get +1 fatigue no matter what troop it is when you attack. Now it says any unit, as long as it can be seen with 1 model, or rather what I should say is if 1 model can see another model unit and it can draw line of sight to it without obstruction, it can attack. And for the case of close order units, of course, they have a frontage. So these guys could only attack things in their front, right? They can't see behind them. They would have to switch into loose formation and then they'd be able to attack in whatever direction. Whereas open formation guys can kind of go whatever direction as long as the line of sight can be drawn and they can see an enemy model. And it does say in the rulebook here that there's no multi-combats. It's just going to be unit per unit. So you're not going to have 3 units ganging up on one unit. And to perform the attack, you are basically going to move like you would the same way in the move rules. So you would have to see moving 1 guy. In this case for attacking, say these guys attack this close formation, you would move 1 guy in 4 inches and you'd want to move the rest of the guys 4 inches following the diameter rule, and it follows the same mechanics as movement, except now they're doing base to base and it's an actual attack, so this will put fatigue on it no matter what the terrain is. And yeah, they move in as close as acceptable as possible with one of the guys, the closest guy, touching the base, and that would be considered an attack. If some of the guys behind them aren't quite in there, but they are close enough within that 4 inch diameter after you move in, that is fine. Now, if it was vice versa, before you can move into attack, you have to make sure that all the enemies in that closed order would be able to move their full 2 inches to attacks, okay? So it's maybe a little more difficult to attack in closed order. I think closed order is definitely more of a defensive position than an offensive one. But yeah, it's going to be a little more limited attacking in a closed formation. And then when that happens, when the attack goes on, you go into melee, and we're going to discuss melee in more detail in the next video, I believe. And of course, once you go into the attack action, again, you put an action point on there and add the fatigue onto the unit that did the attack. So they're going to be moving into base-to-base contact with the enemy, as I showed here. One model needs to reach, at least just one model needs to reach it. It can be any unit of line of sight, and the close order units can only go to their front, obviously. Finally, yeah, then they start fighting, and they have to do some back and forth fighting until a unit retreats or gives up. Or we'll talk about it later, how it works out in the next chapter. So, got a little more dark in here or something, I'm not sure. So remember, when you're doing attacking, when you attack, you get +1 fatigue for attacking, but you may also be moving through rough terrain as you move to attack. So you still have to consult the fatigue chart to see if you are accumulating even more fatigue. So if you got like guys that are in rough terrain and they're really heavy and they move into attack, they may accumulate 1 from moving in the rough terrain plus the 1 from the attack itself. So you kind of have to judge where and how you want to attack. You may not want to do much attacking with heavy troops in very rough terrain if they're already kind of fatigued right up. So it's very situational. It's something you have to measure while you're playing. And I think this is why Clash is so good, because you're not just sitting back and one side's attacking. You're monitoring and making sure your troops are going to be able to do what they need to do when they need to in order to respond to the enemy. Now there's something called the all-out attack, okay? So an all-out attack is basically the same idea as an attack. This difference is an all-out attack is going to accumulate 2 fatigue, and only open formation troops can perform it. If you're close formation, you can't do this. So it's basically going to be the same execution as an attack, except you must be in an open formation. The difference here, however, in an all-out attack is that in a combat itself, it says that any unmodified to hit rolls of 6 that would normally cause a single hit actually cause 2 hits instead. So an all-out attack is like, you're telling these troops to give it their all and just, almost like bum rush the enemy and just fight their hardest. So it's going to cause more fatigue on top of their movement. So you check the fatigue chart for moving, then you check to see if the all-out attack, the all-out attack is going to add +2. The advantage here, though, of course, is that if you hit any 6, you're causing 2 hits instead of just 1 hit, and that's unmodified 6s. So anything that hits with a 6 is going to cause some severe damage if you do an all-out attack. So I think if you do that, you kind of want to make sure that your troops don't have much fatigue and they're fighting against something they can maybe really crack up. And we won't get into it right away here, but later on we'll see there's some certain traits and special traits that may change us up a bit, but we're going to keep focusing on the actual actions here. I sadly have no archers to represent this next part, but another thing you can do is shoot. If you got guys that are armed with bows and arrows, they can shoot at enemies. So this is something like guys with arrows and bows. Now to shoot again is a fatigue point. So every time you shoot once, you're going to add a fatigue onto the unit. All right. Now in Clash of Spears here, they're able to shoot at an enemy within range, but you can't split fire between units. You're going to be shooting at one unit. As for shooting itself, when you're measuring, you're going to measure from the distance between the closest models. So if you had one guy here and a bunch of archers behind him and an enemy here in open formation, and you'd measure from the front guy to the closest guy there for purposes of ranging distance. And to shoot, you'll need at least one guy able to see the enemy over there, just one. So when you are shooting, and I don't have guys with bows, but we'll just use these lads here. They're probably going to throw, not shoot. Throw is a different action. But say these guys are armed with bows, and this guy wants to shoot right up here. Maybe these guys should be back a little. So they're going to shoot at them here. This guy would be the closest, and he can see him at the closest. You're doing all the measuring from here. First, you have to determine if it's a short range or a long range. I should say close range, not short range, but close range. Same idea. Short range, close range. Basically, if it's in close range, you're rolling 1d6 per model that can see at least one enemy model. So at close range here, these guys would be firing 5d6 shots because you got 5 guys with bows, So at close range, wham, 5d6 hits against his enemy. Where if they were long range, they're further back and they're outside of the close range value, but they're still within bow range, you would take 5 and halve it, rounding up. So in this case, if you've got 5 guys, you'd be hitting 3d6 instead of 5, because I mean half is 2.5 of 5, or half of 5 is 2.5, and rounded up would be 3, so it would be 3d6 at long range. And then you of course have to check if there's any modifiers like that, fatigue and all that stuff, and basically any rolls that match or exceed the range stat of a unit would count as hits. And this would be very obvious, I think. Basically say these guys hit with 5 and they roll 3 successful hits, then this guy would roll 1d6 per hit and compare it to their armor save versus their save stat, basically. And of course, if they don't save it, they don't match or exceed that save, they remove a model. It's a casualty. It does say something interesting in the book. It says something like, only models that are seen by the attacker. So I mean, does that mean if there was a big pillar here and these guys could only see these 4 guys, does that mean that if they hit with all 5, only 4 guys would die? I think that's what it's trying to say. You basically have to be able to see what you're shooting at. Anything else extra would be overkill. So make sure when you're shooting, you see everything. There's also cover. Like say these guys are here, something like this, and they can see everyone and they're close range, but the guy being attacked can say, you know, these guys are behind cover, so he's going to have -1 to your rolls. Basically with the hill, if these guys are shooting with something that's shooting through 3 inches or more of a high terrain, it'll also affect it. So you can -1 from that. There's also some shield rules that come into play we'll look at later that may cause some negatives to their shooting attacks. Yeah, of course you're going to roll saves and take the morale test if at least 1 hit was, even if it was saved. So remember we talked about the morale and stuff. If you take hits and stuff, you're going to have to do the morale saves and all that. So there's kind of a strange, I don't think it's strange, it's a little different from other games. These guys, the attacker can decide somehow, I don't know if you have to agree on it or not, but if these attackers say, okay, we're not going to do the cover modifier, and these guys do have covers, or cover modifiers there, only guys that aren't behind the cover can be hit. Now, I'm not sure if this is something you mutually agree with, or if someone's deciding it, or if he's claiming cover or not. I think that's something maybe you can discuss in the game, how you interpret the rules. But there is a modifier where if you say these guys are behind cover, these guys shoot and don't add the modifier, then only the guys not behind cover will actually be taking casualties. I don't know if that's advantageous or what, but that's how I'm reading the rules, and that's how I'm going to explain it here. You can correct me otherwise if you have another way to look at it. Throwing is also an option for, and it's just similar like shooting. It is a little different though because you do add some movement into the throw. The difference is that throwing, you're able to make a 2-inch move, be it your open or closed formation, and they can move a 2-inch move and then measure that distance towards the enemy. So yeah, if you are close with an enemy here and you throw, you can move up 2 inches with, remember you can't move within 1 inch of the enemy, so make sure you're far enough away, but they can move up 2 inches and then they throw their javelins or darts or whatever they've got. Now this attack here works just the same as shooting. If they're close range, it's all of the models. If it's longer range, then it's going to be the models rounded up just like last time. In this case it'd be 3 guys, not the full 5. Again, then you roll to hit you roll to hit to save and do the morale test just like you would with shooting. And if there's cover involved, it's just going to be the same kind of -1 rule as the shooting has as well. So it's kind of similar to shooting, except there's a movement involved. Plus, I think throwing is going to be a lot shorter range than shooting. Typically, it is in most games. Another action is simply ready. And ready doesn't cause any fatigue. That's exactly what ready means. Ready just means that you're sitting there doing nothing. Well, you're not doing nothing. In this case, in Clash of Spears, there's certain weapons that might need a reload. Like, maybe these guys need to pull up more javelins to throw. Or maybe, maybe in the case of, in the future, there's crossbows. They need to use the ready action. It won't cause any fatigue, but it does allow a unit to be ready for the enemy, and it does allow some reloading or prep on the enemy's part. The weapons will specifically state, the rulebook says, what requires the ready action. And of course, no fatigue happens when you are just ready. Alright, there's also the form close order action. Let's put these lads into open order here, trying to keep them as close as possible as the clash of spears diameter would allow. In here it says if you want to form a close order. Now this one causes no fatigue. You'll still have to check the fatigue chart for movement and stuff, but to form close order causes no fatigue. Basically, you take a lad, you move him 4 inches, and then you move the other models legally within 4 inches of the formation to form the closed order. So, you know, he could like about face like this, as long as he's 4 inches, and then they could all turn. If they can all move within 4 inches and form a closed order, they can do that. And then once they've formed their closed formation in whatever direction here, you put the action token beside them, and then you check if there was any, you know, terrain causing fatigue on the fatigue chart. Maybe this is in rough terrain and it made him a little tired by forming that formation. It doesn't look really good. They've decided to form up this way away from the enemy so they can throw javelins in their back. Very smart. I don't have any mounted cavalry, but doing a mounted shooting shot is also +1 fatigue, of course, with the different movement fatigue involved with cavalry and the like. But basically here what you're doing is you're moving. It's kind of a move and shoot thing. You move half the movement allowed. You take your shot, considering if it's again like missile weapons, if it's close or long range, and then you do the rest of your move to hit. And again, the modifiers still come into play if they're in cover or not, just like we talked about in shooting. So mounted troops are basically move half, shoot, then move the rest that they want. You know, maybe they want to get closer to the enemy in their movement, so they move up. Maybe they got 4 inches to move, they move 2, they shoot, and then they move the rest of their 2. It's something just like them. I don't have mounted troops to really go through it well, but yeah, they can also do mounted shooting. I'm sure there's also mounted throwing. I'm not sure if mounted throwing is a thing, if it's considered the same. I would just assume that mounted throwing is just the same as mounted shooting, but I'm sure in the rules later, if we have new mediums and stuff, we'll see how that works out. Now I brought out my commander here. He'd probably be better represented on one base instead of a multi-base circle base for Clash of Spears. But for this purpose, let's just pretend he's on one base here. There's additional character actions, and the actions themselves don't cause any fatigue. They're all +0. It's attach and detach to units, but there may be movement involved, and attaching to units may have some additional fatigue or action tokens put onto a unit. Basically, if you want to attach to a unit, you move to the unit that you want following the move rules, and he basically attaches and becomes part of that unit. Then his when this happens, the character's action phase does end, and then he may become the reactive player if they successfully do that. And it makes sense that if you're on foot, you can only join infantry units. If you're on a horse, you can only join units that have horses. So infantry join infantry, and cavalry join cavalry. Now, what happens when you join a unit is that you compare the commander's action and fatigue to the unit's action points and fatigue. Because if you have any action tokens and fatigue, it carries over into the unit there. So, yeah, you want to kind of make sure if you're attaching, you're not maybe slowing down the unit even more than it might be. So whatever's got the highest is what you get in the end. So if this commander comes in bringing a bunch of action points and fatigue, the whole unit suddenly has them. He's attached to it, and you use the higher of the two when you are attaching. The highest number of action tokens between the units and the character is what the unit will have after it attaches. And once a unit has attached, then he'll benefit from all the rules that that unit has as well, okay? So he just basically becomes part of that unit. So, for example, say these guys have really heavy shields, and he joins this unit, and he doesn't have a heavy shield. He would suddenly be allowed to use that rule with heavy shields. Also, characters won't add any shooting attacks if they join. So sometimes these commanders can add attacks and stuff, but they won't add shooting unless they have a special rule that allows them, or special weapons that allow them to add missile attacks, okay? Now, if they're taking wounds, if you own the unit, you can assign the wounds to the rest of the unit before you put them to the attached character. So these guys are getting beat up. His bodyguard or his unit can take the wounds before the commander himself. The same goes with excess fatigue and stuff. If he's attached, you can put on the unit rather than the commander. The other rule is detaching, and a detached character basically uses an action to individually leave from the unit. If he's got any fatigue or any stats in them, of course he's going to have to test individually against his own grit stat, okay? Basically, you just move them away from base-to-base contact from the unit, and what happens is that the character moving, the model itself will have the same number of action tokens and fatigue as the unit. So if he leaves this unit, he detaches, he ends up with the same action tokens and fatigues when he leaves it. He doesn't just leave scot-free and leave stuff behind. He's also going to be leaving with the same amount of action tokens as fatigue as the unit he just left from. And he also will have to check after moving, because you have to move to check the fatigue chart, and also have another action token for doing that, for leaving. If he fails to leave, because you do have to test to see if he leaves, then he just sticks with the unit. And of course, this all again causes the active players and the reactive players' roles to switch if you fail that test, right? So all of these actions that you can do that I just discussed, they can potentially fail or not work out. And again, remember, we can switch between active and reactive role, or the other player could react. Now, there might be a lot here that I've gone through to kind of chew and swallow. I just wanted to give kind of like a descriptive rundown of all these actions. But when we do some demonstrations here, it's going to be much more clear, I think, when we're playing around with the rules. So that's all I want to say for the activation phase. Of course, we have the final phase here. We'll discuss the end phase. Now, in the recovery phase, in the end phase, you want to remove all the action tokens that the units gain during the last turn. So both enemy and ally, they're going to remove all these action tokens. If you did not use all your action tokens, you get to recover fatigue, which is a good thing. So if you got a really tired unit here that didn't use any action, they get to remove 3 fatigue, which might be really useful. It's basically them resting that turn. And this very handy chart basically explains what you're doing. You start looking, it says that earlier on, it says you look at who had the initiative first to remove it. I think it may not matter unless there's special rules. But basically, yeah, if you've got 0 action tokens, a unit's removing 3 fatigue points, which is good for tests and stuff later. If you used all your actions, though, they had no chance to rest. That means that they don't remove any fatigue. So you really have to watch in this game the balance between performing actions and the balance between not performing actions. Basically, resting and not resting will determine how well or good your units will be doing. And once you've looked at this, it does say here that you should also look at any delayed effects or special rules affecting units. And that's individual. We won't go through that exactly now. But yeah, if they do have any delayed actions or something that needs to be resolved, after you check the action points and how much fatigue is removed in this recovery section, then you'd look at the delayed effects. And finally here, you have to check to see if the victory conditions are met, to see if you won. So each scenario, of course, has a specific victory condition. Did you fulfill them? Did you win the game or did you lose the game? This is the stage you basically evaluate it. Maybe the goal of the scenario is to wipe out half the enemy. If half the enemy's gone, hey, you won. If the goal is to, hold the post or hold the fort for 3 turns and it's now turn 3 going on to turn 4, if you've held the fort and you've not lost them, all your troops, you've won, right? So depending on the scenario, then you just check to see if you won. And that is basically it for the sequences of play. That's the end of chapter 4, and that's all I want to go through today. I'm sorry if it seemed a little more technical today, but I just wanted to blow off all of those actions and the end phase here. Hopefully it was clear and you guys get what I was trying to show here. I really think once we get through the rule book as a walkthrough and we start doing actual gameplay, everything will be a lot more clear. I can make mistakes better once we start playing back and forth solo here. And I've got some Samnite guys I'm finishing up. They're all going to be multi-based, but I think it'll be better to represent my Romans fighting Samnites when we do some more of this combat and rules and actions and putting it all together as one. Anyway, the next time we do one of these videos, we were going to go into close combat in chapter 5, and I think that's what most people like to see, fighting and how the fighting works. A lot of the action-based stuff is very important in this game, but for some reason in my videos, people like the close combat. I don't blame them. You want to see people fight and die. I get it. I do too. Anyway, thank you all for watching. Like and subscribe. We'll keep doing these walkthroughs throughout Clash of Spears, and eventually and soon we're going to do some solo gaming with Clash of Spears after we get through this walkthrough. So thank you all for watching. See you on the next one.